They told him it was just a tour of Sunset Grove Senior Living. 15 minutes later, his family had disappeared, leaving nothing but signed admission papers at the front desk. Now, he spends his days in the community room of the care home, a silent figure in a worn armchair by the window. To the staff and other residents, he's just another abandoned elder, one of many whose children dropped them off and never returned. His daily routine never changes. Breakfast at 8, watching old movies in the common room, and hours of staring at the parking lot, as if waiting for a car that never comes. But when a new volunteer notices something peculiar about the way he reacts to the evening news, she begins to suspect this forgotten grandfather might be harboring a secret that could change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sunset Grove Senior Living stood like a faded postcard from the 1980s, its salmon-pink walls and white trim showing their age, despite the staff's best efforts to maintain them. The three-story building curved like a horseshoe around a central courtyard, where concrete paths wound between raised flower beds and metal benches. Every morning at precisely 7, the fluorescent lights in the corridors buzzed to life, marking the beginning of another identical day. In room 237, the old man was already awake, sitting on the edge of his neatly made bed. He didn't need the wake-up call that would come through the intercom in 30 minutes. Sleep had become a stranger since that Tuesday 3 months ago, when his son Michael had guided him through these halls with a hand on his elbow, speaking enthusiastically about the wonderful facilities and caring community. The room held the essentials: a single bed with a blue cotton blanket, a wooden dresser with 3 drawers, a small desk by the window, and a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in. The walls were bare except for the mandatory emergency evacuation plan and a calendar from the local pharmacy, its pages untouched since his arrival. At 7:45, he made his way to the dining room, taking measured steps with his aluminum walker. The same faces occupied the same tables every morning. Mrs. Peterson, with her collection of pill bottles arranged like chess pieces before her. Mr. Rodriguez, who insisted on wearing a tie to breakfast. The Collins sisters, twin widows who finished each other's sentences. "Good morning," chirped Sandra, the morning shift nurse, as she did every day. "Did you sleep well?" He responded with his usual slight nod, neither confirming nor denying. Sandra's smile never wavered, but her eyes held the practiced patience of someone used to working with the elderly and difficult. The breakfast routine played out like a well-rehearsed play. Oatmeal with brown sugar on Mondays and Thursdays, scrambled eggs on Tuesdays and Fridays, pancakes on Wednesdays, French toast on weekends. Coffee served lukewarm in thick ceramic mugs, orange juice in plastic cups that wouldn't shatter if dropped. The clinking of spoons against bowls provided the morning soundtrack, along with the squeaking of shoes on linoleum and the occasional announcement over the intercom. Other residents had tried to draw him out in those first few weeks. Mrs. Peterson had invited him to join her bridge group. Mr. Rodriguez had offered to share his newspaper. The Collins sisters had saved him a seat at movie night. But he remained distant, responding only with nods or shakes of his head, his silence a wall between him and their well-meaning attempts at friendship. The staff had their theories about his muteness. Some thought it was depression, common enough. Among new residents, especially those whose families rarely visited, others suspected the early stages of dementia, though his medical records showed no such diagnosis. The facility's psychologist had attempted several sessions, but he had simply sat there, eyes fixed on the window, hands folded in his lap. Only at night, when the halls grew quiet and the overhead lights dimmed to their evening setting, did he allow himself to remember. The memories came unbidden. Michael's first steps, taken in the backyard of their old house. Sarah's high school graduation, her valedictorian speech making his chest swell with pride. The grandchildren's sticky fingers and gap-toothed smiles at birthday parties and holiday gatherings. He kept no photos on display. They remained tucked away in the bottom drawer of his dresser, along with the birthday cards and crayon drawings that had once adorned his refrigerator. The only personal item visible was his wedding ring, still circling his finger, though his wife had been gone for 5 years now. Each evening, after the dinner dishes had been cleared and the medication cart had made its rounds, he took his place in the common room. The television mounted on the wall played news broadcasts and syndicated game shows, but his attention seemed focused elsewhere, on something beyond the glass walls that separated Sunset Grove from the rest of the world. The night staff had grown, used to finding him there long after other residents had retired to their rooms. They learned to dim the lights around him last, to check on him without disturbing his vigil. Sometimes they found him mouthing words silently, his fingers tapping against the armrest in patterns they couldn't decipher. When sleep finally claimed him, it was often there in that chair, his chin tucked against his chest, his breathing deep and even. The night nurse would gently wake him, guide him back to room 237, and help him into bed. He never resisted, never spoke, but his eyes held, an alertness that belied his apparent surrender to the routines of institutional living. And so the days passed, each indistinguishable from the last, marked only by the changing of shifts, the rotation of meals, and the slow progression of seasons visible through the windows. To everyone at Sunset Grove, he was simply the silent man in room 237, another soul warehoused in the twilight of life, waiting for visits that never came and calls that were never made. But beneath the silence, behind the vacant stares and passive compliance, something else lurked. Something that made him study each new face that entered Sunset Grove with careful intensity. Something that kept him awake long into the night. Something that made him flinch at certain names mentioned on the evening news. A secret that would soon shatter the quiet routine of Sunset Grove senior living and prove that some silences speak louder than words. Every evening at 6 o'clock, the common room at Sunset Grove underwent a subtle transformation. The sounds of afternoon card games and gossip gave way to the authoritative voices of news anchors. While most residents dozed or chatted through the broadcast, the silent man's attention never wavered from the screen. His posture would change during these hours, the stooped shoulders straightening imperceptibly, his hands gripping the armrests with white-knuckled intensity. He positioned himself in the same spot each night, third chair from the left, angled precisely to view both the television and the room's entrance. The staff had learned not to stand between him and the screen during certain segments. Tonight, the news droned on about local events, a county fair, weather predictions, traffic updates. His eyes remained fixed but relaxed, his breathing steady. Then came a segment about a recently paroled convict. The change was instant. His fingers began their mysterious tapping, a rapid sequence that looked almost like code. His lips moved, silently, forming words that no one could catch. Mrs. Peterson, watching from her usual spot by the window, had her own theory about their silent resident. Military, she whispered to anyone who would listen. You can tell by the way he sits. My Harold was the same way, always aware of the exits, always watching. The Collins sisters preferred a more romantic explanation, speculating about lost love and hidden fortunes. Mr. Rodriguez, a retired history teacher, insisted the man's bearing suggested government work. In his room, evidence of his former life remained carefully concealed. The bottom drawer of his dresser held more than just family photos. Beneath the layer of birthday cards and children's drawings lay a metal box, its surface unmarked except for a small keyhole. The key itself hung on a chain around his neck, hidden under his shirts, never removed even during showers. Each night, after the news ended and the other residents dispersed for dinner, he would return to his room and perform the same ritual. The door would be locked, the curtains drawn. Sitting at his small desk, he would remove the key from his neck and open the box. Inside, yellowed newspaper clippings lay preserved in plastic sleeves, their headlines carefully cut to reveal no dates. A small notebook contained pages of handwritten numbers and letters, arranged in no discernible pattern. A single photograph, older than the others, showed a group of men in dark suits, their faces serious. The edge of the photo appeared torn, as if someone had been deliberately removed from the image. The night staff had noticed other peculiarities. During his rare periods of sleep, he would sometimes mutter in what sounded like code numbers. His trash can never contained anything more revealing than tissues and breakfast bar wrappers. All important papers were either stored away or carefully destroyed, torn into tiny pieces and disposed of in different bins throughout the facility. Sometimes, during the day, he would pause in his wanderings through the corridors, head tilted slightly as if listening for something. His eyes would scan the paintings on the walls, generic landscapes and still lifes, with an intensity that suggested he was looking for more than just artistic merit. During fire drills, while other residents complained or grew confused, he moved with purposeful efficiency, noting each exit and gathering point. The facility's maintenance man, Ted, had once attempted to fix a loose handle on his dresser. He found the drawer's interior lined with what looked like thick felt, something that didn't come standard with the furniture. When Ted mentioned this oddity in the break room, the head nurse quickly changed the subject, but her eyes darted toward the security cameras in a way that made others wonder. Visitors to Sunset Grove often felt his gaze following them, especially if they were new faces. He seemed to pay particular attention to men in their 50s or 60s, his expression unchanging, but his body tensing visibly when they passed too close. The facility's guestbook, open on a table near the entrance, never escaped his notice. From his chair in the common room, he had a clear view of everyone who signed in and out. One day, a delivery man had dropped a package, producing a sharp bang that echoed through the hallway. While other residents jumped or complained, the silent man had moved with startling speed, pushing Mrs. Peterson's wheelchair away from the window before anyone else had even processed the sound. He resumed his usual slow pace moments later, but the incident sparked new rumors among the staff. The social worker assigned to his case had attempted to update his file with emergency contacts and personal history. His previous records were surprisingly sparse, just the basic medical information and the paperwork his son had filled out. Attempts to contact his family for more details were met with short, uninformative responses. "He's always been private," his son had said, voice tight with what might have been guilt or something else. "It's better this way." At night, after the box was safely locked and returned to its hiding place, he would sit by his window, watching the parking lot below. The facility's security lights cast elongated shadows across the asphalt, and he studied these shifting patterns with the concentration of someone who had learned the hard way that darkness could hide more than just secrets. On his bedside table, a simple digital clock glowed red in the darkness. Unlike the other residents' clocks, this one was set exactly 3 minutes fast, a detail so small it might have seemed meaningless to most. But like everything else about the silent man in room 237, it felt deliberate, calculated, part of a larger pattern that had yet to reveal itself. As another day drew to a close at Sunset Grove, the quiet halls and dimmed lights masked the tension of unspoken words and unnamed fears. In room 237, the silent man prepared for another night of vigilance, guardian of secrets that refused to fade into the past. Soon, the arrival of a new face would shatter this careful routine, forcing long-buried truths into the light. But for now he waited, watched, and remembered. A sentinel at his post, even in this place of scheduled meals and supervised activities, knowing that some duties never end, some promises must be kept at any cost. Emma Chen shifted nervously in her seat as Mrs. Garcia, the volunteer coordinator at Sunset Grove, reviewed her application. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a job interview than a volunteer orientation. At 23, Emma was significantly younger than the facility's usual volunteers, most of whom were retirees themselves. "Your journalism background is interesting," Mrs. Garcia noted, adjusting her reading glasses. "We don't get many students from the university interested in helping out here." She looked up, her expression both curious and mildly suspicious. "May I ask what drew you to Sunset Grove specifically?" Emma had rehearsed this answer, knowing her true motivations might sound too professional, too calculated. "My own grandfather passed away in a facility like this last year," she said, the truth lending weight to her words. "I was too busy with classes to visit him as often as I should have. This feels like a way to make up for that somehow." Mrs. Garcia's face softened. "Well, we can certainly use the help, especially with our more—" She paused, searching for the right word, challenging residents. The orientation tour took them through corridors that all looked identical to Emma's untrained eye. Residents in wheelchairs or with walkers moved slowly along the walls, some greeting Mrs. Garcia with varying degrees of lucidity. The air held that distinct institutional mix of disinfectant and bland food that seemed universal to all care facilities. "We'll start you in the common room during evening hours," Mrs. Garcia explained, leading Emma into a large space furnished with worn but clean armchairs and small tables. "Many of our residents gather here for the news and evening programs. Some need help with their drinks, others just appreciate having someone to talk to." That's when Emma first saw him, the silent man in the third chair from the left. Unlike the other residents who dozed or chatted or stared vacantly into space, his attention was fixed on the television with an intensity that seemed out of place in the leisurely atmosphere of the common room. "Who's that?" Emma asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Mrs. Garcia followed her gaze. "Ah, room 237. He's been with us for 3 months now. Hasn't spoken a word since his family left him here." She lowered her voice. "We tried to engage him, but—" She shrugged, the gesture conveying both sympathy and resignation. Emma watched as the news segment changed to a story about a recent prison release. The silent man's fingers began tapping against his armrest in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern. His lips moved slightly, and his eyes narrowed with what looked like recognition. "Does he always watch the news this intently?" Emma asked. "Every evening at 6, Mrs. Garcia replied. "Never misses it. The only time he shows any real reaction to anything." She checked her watch. "Come on, I'll show you the activity room where we do most of our social programs." But Emma's journalistic instincts were already firing. Something about the man's reaction to the news story felt significant. As they left the common room, she glanced back. For a brief moment his eyes met hers, and she caught something in them that didn't match his supposed vacancy. A sharp, evaluating intelligence that made her breath catch. Over the next few hours, Emma learned the basics of her volunteer duties, helping with activities, serving snacks, providing companionship to the residents. But her mind kept returning to the silent man and his mysterious behavior. After the orientation, Emma made her way to the facility's small library, where residents' files were kept in a locked cabinet. Mrs. Garcia had given her access for recording, activity participation. While logging her orientation hours, she couldn't resist glancing at the drawer marked 230-239. The file for room 237 was surprisingly thin. The admission papers listed him as James Zhang, age 72. Former occupation retired accountant. No allergies, no major medical conditions. Emergency contact, Michael Zhang, son. Local address, but no visits recorded. The paperwork seemed almost too perfect, too sparse for a life that had spanned 7 decades. As Emma prepared to leave for the evening, she passed by the common room one last time. The silent man, James, was still there, but the news had ended. He sat staring at the now silent television, his hands still moving in that strange pattern. On impulse, Emma entered the room. "Good evening, Mr. Zhang," she said softly, moving into his line of sight. "I'm Emma, the new volunteer." He turned to look at her, his expression unchanged. But something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, assessment. His fingers stilled on the armrest. "I'll be here in the evenings," she continued, maintaining eye contact. "Maybe we can watch the news together sometimes." For a moment, she thought she saw his lips part, as if he might speak. Instead, he gave her the slightest of nods, so subtle she might have imagined it. But it was something, a crack in the wall of silence. As Emma drove home that evening, her mind raced with questions. Why did a supposedly retired accountant watch the news with such tactical awareness? What was the meaning behind his finger-tapping patterns? And why did his file feel so carefully crafted, so deliberately ordinary? She hadn't told Mrs. Garcia the whole truth about why she'd chosen Sunset Grove. Her journalism professor had assigned a human interest story about aging in America, suggesting she focus on the increasing problem of elderly abandonment. But something told Emma that the story in room 237 went far deeper than family neglect. That night, she dug out her old notebooks from her investigative journalism class. Her professor's words echoed in her memory. "The best stories aren't always the ones that shout the loudest. Sometimes they're the ones wrapped in silence, waiting for someone to listen carefully enough." In room 237, James Zhang prepared for another sleepless night, his thoughts now occupied with the new variable in his carefully maintained routine, a young volunteer whose eyes held too many questions. For the first time in 3 months, he allowed himself to wonder if his silence might soon become harder to maintain. Emma's first week at Sunset Grove fell into a routine. She arrived each evening at 5:30, helped serve dinner to the residents who needed assistance, and then took her place in the common room just before the news began. She always chose a seat that gave her a clear view of James Zhang while appearing to focus on other residents. On her third day, she noticed something odd. During a news segment about a local real estate developer's arrest, James's finger-tapping changed. Instead of his usual pattern, his index finger tapped rapidly 3 times, followed by a pause, then 2 slower taps. Emma casually pulled out her phone and recorded the sequence, pretending to check her messages. The facility's cleaning staff had grown used to finding Emma in the common room long after her shift ended. She would sit with a notebook in her lap, ostensibly working on college assignments, while carefully documenting James's reactions to different news stories. "You're wasting your time with that one, honey," warned Gloria, a night shift cleaner, who'd worked at Sunset Grove for 15 years. "Some folks just prefer their silence." But Emma noticed how Gloria always seemed to clean around James's chair last, giving him extra time to watch the evening broadcasts. One evening, while helping to serve coffee, Emma accidentally on purpose knocked over James's cup. As she cleaned up the spill, she caught a glimpse of something hanging from a chain around his neck, a key quickly tucked back beneath his shirt by hands that moved with surprising dexterity for their age. The break in her investigation came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Peterson, the resident gossip, cornered Emma by the medication cart one evening. "Did you see the news last night?" she asked, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "About that old case they're reopening." Emma hadn't. She'd missed her shift due to a study group, but Mrs. Peterson was eager to fill her in. "A big corruption case from 30 years ago. Someone from witness protection finally came forward. They showed pictures of the original investigation team, and I swear—" She glanced around before continuing. "One of them looked just like our quiet friend. Younger, of course, but that same way of holding himself." That night, after her shift, Emma stayed late at the university library, searching through digitized newspaper archives. She found the story Mrs. Peterson had mentioned, a massive corruption case involving city officials and organized crime. The article included a grainy photograph of the investigation team, but most faces were obscured or blurred for security reasons. As she was about to leave, a small detail caught her eye. In the corner of the photograph, partially visible, was a hand resting on a desk. The fingers were tapping against the wood in what seemed to be a pattern. The next day, Emma arrived early for her shift. The residents were still at dinner when she slipped into the common room. James's usual chair sat empty. Moving carefully, she ran her hands along the armrest where he always sat. Her fingers found subtle indentations in the wood, worn smooth by years of repetitive tapping. A sound at the doorway made her jump. James stood there, watching her with those unnervingly alert eyes. For a moment, neither moved. Then, deliberately, he walked to his chair and sat down. His fingers found their usual place on the armrest, but this time his tapping seemed directed at her. Emma watched, heart pounding, as his fingers moved in what she now suspected was Morse code. 3 fast taps, 2 slow ones, the same pattern. She'd documented during the news about the real estate developer. She'd learned Morse code for a summer camp activity years ago, and though she was rusty, she recognized an S when she saw one. Before she could process this revelation, the evening news began. The lead story was about a series of unexpected retirements from the police force, high-ranking officials stepping down with little explanation. James's entire body tensed, though his expression remained carefully neutral. His fingers began tapping out a new pattern, more urgent than before. Emma's phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from her journalism professor about her upcoming assignment. But as she reached to silence it, she noticed something else. 3 missed calls from an unlisted number to the facility's main line, all during her evening shifts. Each call had been brief, less than 30 seconds. The pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture that both thrilled and frightened her. James Zhang wasn't just a silent old man abandoned by his family. His silence was a choice, his isolation a necessity, and now something in the outside world was threatening to disrupt the careful walls he'd built around himself. As the news ended and other residents began shuffling off to their rooms, James remained in his chair, but this time, when Emma gathered her things to leave, he reached out and caught her wrist. His grip was firm, deliberate. In his other hand, he held a small piece of paper torn from a newspaper margin. On it, in shaky but clear handwriting, were 2 words. Be careful. Emma couldn't sleep that night. James's warning note burning a hole in her desk drawer at home. The next morning, she arrived at Sunset Grove earlier than usual, clutching a worn leather notebook and a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She found James in the garden, sitting on a bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. Unlike his usual spot in the common room, this location offered clear views of both the parking lot and the facility's main entrance. Not for the first time, Emma noticed how his seemingly random choices of location always provided optimal surveillance. "Points. Good morning, Mr. Zhang," she said, approaching slowly. From her notebook, she withdrew his warning note from the previous night. "I think we need to talk." He didn't respond, but his eyes flickered to the empty space beside him on the bench. Emma sat down, maintaining a respectful distance. From her notebook, she pulled out a printout of the old newspaper photograph she'd found, the one with the tapping hand in the corner. "I've been watching your hands," she said quietly, laying the photo on the bench between them. 3 taps, 2 slower ones. SOS. You've been sending messages all this time, haven't you? Just waiting for someone to notice." James remained still, his face impassive, but his fingers had stopped their usual tapping. The morning sun cast dappled shadows through the oak leaves, creating shifting patterns across his weathered features. "I'm not here to expose you," Emma continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I think you're in danger. Those news stories about the reopened corruption case, the police retirements, they're connected to you, aren't they?" For a long moment, only the chirping of birds and distant traffic filled the silence. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, James spoke his first words in 3 months. "You should walk away." His voice was rough from disuse, but the tone was clear, not threatening, but concerned, protective even. Emma's heart raced at this breakthrough, but she kept her expression calm. "I can't do that. Not when I know someone's life might be in danger. Not when I might be able to help." James turned to look at her fully then, his eyes sharp and evaluating. "You're very young," he said, each word measured and deliberate. "You don't understand what you're getting into." "Then help me understand," Emma replied. She pulled out another piece of paper, her notes on his reactions to various news stories over the past week. "You've been monitoring them, haven't you? Through the news, keeping track of who's being released, who's retiring unexpectedly." A ghost of a smile touched James's lips. "You're observant, like your grandfather." Emma blinked in surprise. "How did you—" "The way you hold your pen," he said. "Left-handed, but you curve your hand to avoid smudging. You mentioned a grandfather. In the care home. Most people don't notice details like smudged ink, but investigators do." "He was a detective," Emma admitted. "In San Francisco," James nodded slightly. "John Chen. He worked the Wong case in '89. Good man." Emma's mouth fell open. "You knew him. We crossed paths." James's voice grew stronger with each word, as if the act of speaking was helping him remember who he used to be. "He had the same look you do, like a dog with a bone, unable to let go of a mystery." The morning sun had risen higher, and other residents were beginning to emerge into the garden. James's posture shifted subtly, becoming more guarded, but before he could retreat back into his silence, Emma made a decision. She pulled out her student ID card and a small photo tucked behind it, a picture of herself as a child, sitting on her grandfather's lap. In the photo, his detective's badge was clearly visible. "My grandfather always said that doing the right thing isn't about age or experience," she said, showing him the photo. "It's about being there when someone needs help, even if they can't. Ask for it directly." James stared at the photo for a long moment. Then, with hands that trembled slightly, he reached for the chain around his neck. The key glinted in the morning light. "Tonight," he whispered, slipping the chain over his head. "After the news. Bring your notebook." He pressed the key into her hand, his fingers closing hers around it. "And Emma, trust no one else. Not even the staff, especially not the staff." As other residents began filling the garden, James stood and walked away, resuming his customary silence. But something had changed. The wall had cracked, and through that crack, Emma had glimpsed the man. Behind the silence, a man with secrets worth protecting and perhaps worth sharing with the right person. The evening news droned on about local weather and sports, but Emma barely heard it. The key in her pocket felt impossibly heavy, each minute crawling by with excruciating slowness. She'd positioned herself closer to James's chair tonight. Close. Enough to catch his occasional glances in her direction. At precisely 7:30, James rose from his chair with his usual deliberate slowness. As he shuffled past Emma, he murmured, 10 minutes, room 237. His voice was so low she almost missed it. Emma waited, busying herself with helping other residents with their evening tea. When she finally made her way to room 237, her heart was pounding. She knocked softly. "Enter," came the quiet response. James was sitting at his small desk, his posture straighter than she'd ever seen it. The metal box sat before him, its surface unmarked except for the keyhole. "Lock the door," he instructed. Emma did so, then approached the desk. With trembling fingers, she withdrew the key from her pocket. James nodded, and she inserted it into the lock. It turned with a soft click. Inside, the box was meticulously organized. Newspaper clippings, preserved in plastic sleeves, dated back 30 years. Photographs, documents, and a small notebook filled the remaining space, but it was the badge that caught Emma's eye. A police detective's shield, its surface dulled with age. "Your name isn't really Zhang, is it?" Emma asked, though she already knew the answer. "No," he replied, carefully lifting out the badge. That life ended in 1994. Detective James Chen died in a warehouse explosion that year. James Zhang, the accountant, was born in witness protection. Emma's mind raced. Chen, like my grandfather's family? Distant cousins, James confirmed. It's partly why I was assigned to his task force. Family connections made the cover more believable. He spread out several newspaper clippings on the desk. Headlines about corruption, organized crime, and a massive police investigation jumped out at Emma. The Golden Phoenix case, she breathed, recognizing the infamous story from her journalism studies. 30 years of investigating the biggest crime syndicate on the West Coast, James said, his voice taking on a teacher's tone. We thought we'd shut them down in '94. My death was supposed to be the final nail in their coffin, but we were wrong. He pulled out a more recent clipping, one of the stories that had caught his attention during the evening news. They're rebuilding. The old guard is being released from prison, and their children have taken over the family business. More sophisticated now. They hide behind real estate developments, tech startups, legitimate businesses. But why come out of hiding now? Emma asked, scanning the documents. Because they found me, James said simply. 3 months ago, I received a warning from my old handler. Someone had connected James Zhang to Detective Chen. My family, his voice caught slightly, my son and his family, they were potential targets. So I disappeared. Let them think I was just another abandoned elder. Emma's fingers traced the edges of an old photograph, a younger James, in his detective uniform, standing proudly beside his son at a police academy graduation. Does your family know about any of this? James shook his head. Better they think I'm a coward who abandoned them than become targets. The Golden Phoenix doesn't forgive, and they never forget, even after 30 years. He pulled out the small notebook, its pages filled with coded entries. I've been tracking their movements through the news. Old members being released, suspicious. Business deals, unexplained retirements in the force. They're consolidating power again, but more carefully this time. The Morse code, Emma realized. You've been recording their movements. Old habits. James smiled grimly. The tapping helps me remember the details without writing them down where others might see. A noise in the hallway made them both freeze. James quickly but methodically returned everything to the box, leaving out only a single envelope. Take this, he whispered, pressing it into Emma's hands. My old handler's contact information. If anything happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you, Emma interrupted firmly. Promise me, James insisted. If anything seems wrong, you'll contact him immediately. No police, no family, just him. Emma nodded, tucking the envelope into her notebook. As she turned to leave, James caught her arm. You're very much like your grandfather, he said softly. He wouldn't let go of a case either, not when justice was at stake. We'll figure this out, Emma promised, together. As she left room 237 that night, Emma felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She wasn't just investigating a story anymore. She was protecting a man's life, his family's safety, and 30 years of sacrifice. And somewhere, in the city, forces were moving, drawing closer to the quiet retirement home where an old detective maintained his lonely vigil. Emma spent the next few days diving deep into digital archives, cross-referencing the information from James's box with public records. The Golden Phoenix case had been one of the largest organized crime investigations of its time, though many details remained classified. What emerged was a pattern of power, corruption, and carefully orchestrated violence spanning decades. During her evening shift, she noticed subtle changes in James's behavior. His gaze lingered longer on certain visitors, and his fingers tapped out more urgent messages during the news broadcasts. Something was making him nervous. Tell me about the warehouse explosion, Emma said quietly one evening, after the other residents had gone to dinner. They sat in their usual spots in the common room, maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. James's eyes scanned the room before he spoke. It wasn't supposed to end that way, he said, his voice barely audible. We had infiltrated their organization at every level, had enough evidence to bring down their entire operation, but someone leaked our raid plans. He paused, his fingers unconsciously tapping against the armrest. They were waiting for us. The explosion was meant to kill everyone, destroy all the evidence. I was the only survivor, and my handler saw an opportunity. Detective Chen died in that fire, along with all his knowledge of the Golden Phoenix's operations. But you kept investigating, Emma said, recognizing the dates on his coded notes. From the shadows. New name, new identity, but the same mission. The syndicate was weakened, their leadership imprisoned, but organizations like that, they're like hydras. Cut off one head, 2 more take its place, Emma finished. She pulled out her notebook, showing him her research. The children of the original leaders. They've been quietly taking control of legitimate businesses, building a new empire. James nodded. More sophisticated than their parents. They deal in digital currency, offshore accounts, corporate takeovers. The violence is still there, but it's hidden better. Accidents, suicides, unexpected retirements, like the police officials. In the news, Emma realized. They're clearing the old guard, James confirmed. Anyone who might remember the original case, who might recognize patterns. That's why he stopped abruptly as a nurse walked past, resuming only when they were alone again. That's why I had to disappear. They're tying up loose ends, and I'm the loosest end of all. Emma studied the careful mask of vacancy he wore, understanding now how much strength it took to maintain. Your family. They think you just abandoned them, left them without explanation. Pain flickered across James's features. Michael was so angry. He didn't understand how I could just give up, move into a home, stop being his father. His voice roughened. But angry is better than dead. The Phoenix would use them to get to me without hesitation. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sounds of dinner service. Emma thought about Michael Zhang, about the pain of believing your father had abandoned you, never knowing he was actually protecting you. There's something else, James said finally. Something not in any of the records. He glanced at his watch. Not here. Tomorrow morning, early. The garden bench. Before Emma could respond, other residents began returning from dinner. James slipped back into his silent persona, but his fingers tapped out a clear message. Trust no one. That night, as Emma drove home, she noticed a dark sedan parked across from her apartment building. It wasn't there when she circled the block. Again, but as she lay in bed, surrounded by her research notes, she couldn't shake the feeling that James's past was catching up with them faster than either had anticipated. In her dreams, she saw the warehouse explosion, imagined a younger James Chen making the impossible choice between his family and their safety. She understood now why he watched the news so intently, why he monitored every visitor. His silence wasn't surrender. It was his last line of defense, and tomorrow morning she would learn the secret that even 30 years of written records couldn't reveal, a truth that might explain why, after all this time, the Golden Phoenix was still hunting the ghost of Detective James Chen. Dawn painted Sunset Grove's gardens in shades of grey when Emma arrived the next morning. A light fog clung to the ground, shrouding the paths in ethereal mist. James was already at the bench, looking more alert than she'd ever seen him. "Did anyone follow you?" he asked without preamble. "No," Emma said, though she'd taken 3 different routes to make sure. "But there was a car outside my apartment last night." James nodded grimly. "They're getting closer, which means you need to know everything." He pulled something from his sweater pocket, a small, worn leather wallet. Inside was a single photograph, its edges frayed with age. "The original leadership of the Golden Phoenix," he explained, pointing to the image of 5 men in expensive suits. "But look at the woman in the background." Emma squinted at the blurry figure partially hidden behind a pillar. "She seems familiar." "She should. That's Victoria Zhao, current CEO of Phoenix Global Investments. and daughter of the Phoenix's original leader. Emma's eyes widened. Phoenix Global was one of the largest investment firms on the West Coast, known for aggressive corporate takeovers and innovative tech ventures. But they cleared her in the original investigation. Because that's what we wanted them to think, James said, his voice dropping lower. She was our inside source. Young, idealistic, horrified by her father's business, she helped us build the entire case. What happened? The night of the warehouse raid, everything went wrong. The leak we thought came from inside the department. It came from her. James's hands trembled slightly. She played both sides, feeding us information while warning her father. The explosion wasn't meant to kill everyone, just the officers who knew she was involved. Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning fog. She sacrificed the investigation to protect herself and built something bigger from the ashes. While her father and uncles went to prison, she stayed clean, transformed their criminal empire into a legitimate business empire, or so it appeared. But you knew the truth, Emma said, understanding dawning. You survived and you knew what she'd done. James nodded. I kept investigating, even in witness protection. Found patterns, too many of their corporate competitors dying in accidents, too many politicians in their pocket. She made the Phoenix more powerful than her father ever dreamed, all while maintaining a perfect public image. Why reveal this now? Because last week, Phoenix Global announced a major healthcare acquisition. They're buying up retirement homes across the country. James's eyes met hers, including Sunset Grove. Emma felt her blood run cold. That's why you've been watching the business news so carefully. Victoria's sending a message. She knows I'm alive, knows I'm here. The retirement home purchase is her way of saying she's found me. He carefully returned the photo to his wallet. Once the sale goes through, every employee will be replaced. New staff, new management, all loyal to the Phoenix. We have to get you out of here, Emma said urgently. Not yet. The sale doesn't close for 2 weeks. And there's something else. James hesitated. Something I never told my handler. Insurance, in case anything happened to me. A door slammed somewhere in the building, making them both tense. James spoke quickly now. In the box, there's a false bottom. The key opens it too. Inside you'll find Mr. Zhang. A nurse's voice called from the garden entrance. Time for your morning medication. James immediately slumped in his seat, resuming his vacant expression. But his fingers tapped rapidly against the bench. Tonight, news, watch. As Emma walked to her car, her mind raced with implications. Victoria Zhao, respected business leader, secret head of a criminal empire. And now she was closing in on the one man who could expose her true identity. The morning fog was burning away, revealing a clear blue sky. But Emma had never felt more in the dark. Whatever evidence lay hidden in that box, she knew they were running out of time to use it. The Phoenix was circling, and Sunset Grove was about to become ground zero in a 30-year-old war. Emma sat in her car outside a modest 2-story house in the suburbs, gathering her courage. The mailbox read, Zhang, in neat black letters, and a child's bicycle lay on its side in the front yard. James's family, the people he'd sacrificed everything to protect, were just steps away. She'd found Michael Zhang's address in Sunset Grove's contact records. Now, watching his house, she understood even more deeply why James had chosen silence. Through the front window, she could see a woman helping. A young girl with homework at the dining table. James's daughter-in-law and granddaughter, unaware they were being protected from shadows they'd never seen. Taking a deep breath, Emma approached the front door and rang the bell. Michael Zhang opened it, looking exactly like the younger version of James she'd seen in old photos, except for the hard set of his jaw. "Can I help you?" he asked, polite but guarded. "Mr. Zhang, I'm Emma Chen, a volunteer at Sunset Grove. I work with your father." Michael's expression closed off immediately. "If he sent you—" "He hasn't," Emma interrupted quickly. "He doesn't know I'm here. I thought you should know he's doing okay. He watches the news every evening at 6. Sometimes he sits in the garden." Something flickered in Michael's eyes. Pain, maybe longing. Does he talk? To anyone? No, Emma said, keeping to the truth as much as possible. But he's aware. More than people think. Michael ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his father's that Emma's heart ached. Would you like to come in for a moment? The house was warm and lived in, photos covering the walls. Emma noticed that recent family pictures showed a conspicuous gap where James should have been. Michael led her to the kitchen, where his wife Susan and daughter Lily looked up curiously. This is Emma, Michael explained. She knows Dad from Sunset Grove. Is Grandpa okay? Lily asked immediately, her homework forgotten. Why doesn't he want to see us anymore? Susan touched her daughter's shoulder. Lily, why don't you go finish your homework upstairs? Once Lily was gone, Michael's composure cracked slightly. I keep trying to explain it to her, but how do you tell a 10-year-old that her grandfather just gave up? 3 months ago, he was at every soccer game, every school event. Then suddenly he decides he needs to go into a home, cuts off all contact. It's like he became a different person overnight, Susan added softly. The man I knew would never have abandoned his family like this. Emma chose her words carefully. Sometimes people have reasons for their actions that we can't understand, reasons they can't explain. What reasons could justify this? Michael demanded, gesturing to a family photo from last Christmas. James beamed in the center, surrounded by his family. He was happy. We were happy. Then one day he calls to say he's moving into Sunset Grove, effective immediately. No discussion, no explanation, just goodbye. Emma studied the photo, noting how even then James's eyes held that watchful quality she now recognized. He'd known even at Christmas that this might be coming. Your father loves you, she said finally. Whatever you believe about his choices, I see it every day. The way he watches the families who visit other residents, how he sits by the window around the time school lets out, as if hoping to catch a glimpse of a familiar car. Michael turned away, but not before Emma saw the moisture in his eyes. Love should be more than just watching from a distance. Sometimes, love means making impossible choices, Emma said, thinking of James's words about anger being better than dead. Sometimes it means bearing pain to prevent something worse. She reached into her bag and pulled out a carefully folded piece of paper. I'm not supposed to do this, but your father sits in this spot in the garden every morning. If someone happened to walk past on the public path behind the fence, they might be visible from there. Susan took the paper, studying the crude map Emma had drawn. Why are you doing this? Because everyone deserves to know they're not forgotten, Emma said simply, even if they can't say it back. As she left the Zhang house, Emma saw Lily watching from an upstairs window. She waved, and the little girl waved back. In her mind, she heard James's voice. Angry is better than dead. But maybe, she thought, there was a space between those extremes, a way to keep both his secret and his family's heart intact. The evening news had just begun when Emma noticed something was wrong. James sat in his usual chair, but his posture was rigid, his fingers drumming an urgent pattern she'd never seen before. On screen, a reporter was covering Phoenix Global's latest acquisitions. Breaking news in the business world as Phoenix Global Investments accelerates its healthcare division expansion. CEO Victoria Zhao announced today that the previously scheduled 2-week closing period for several retirement home acquisitions has been moved up. The transfer of ownership will now take place within 48 hours. Emma felt her blood run cold. They'd just lost 12 days of preparation time. Her eyes met James's across the room, and for the first time she saw real fear in them. But that wasn't what had triggered his warning signal. Following his gaze, Emma noticed 3 men, in maintenance uniforms she didn't recognize, checking the common room's fire extinguishers. Their movements were too precise, their attention more focused on the room's occupants than their supposed task. The nurse on duty, a new hire Emma hadn't seen before, was watching James with poorly concealed interest. Emma's phone vibrated in. Her pocket. A text from an unknown number. Get him out. Now. Handler. She forced herself to move casually, making her way toward James as if to help him with his evening tea. As she approached, he spoke without looking at her, his voice barely a whisper. My room, the box. Get it now. I'm not leaving you, she protested quietly. Third-floor supply closet has a fire escape. Meet me there in 10 minutes. His fingers tapped out one more message. They're here. Emma's heart pounded as she made her way to room 237, trying to appear as if she was simply doing her rounds. She used the key with trembling fingers, grabbing the metal box from its hiding place. As she reached under the false bottom, she found a USB drive and a sealed envelope. Noise in the hallway made her freeze. Footsteps approached, too heavy for the regular staff. Without thinking, she shoved the box into her volunteer tote bag and slipped into the bathroom, leaving the door open just a crack. 2 men entered room 237, their maintenance uniforms incongruous, with their alert, professional movements. One spoke quietly into a radio. Room clear. Subject location? A woman's voice responded. The new nurse. Still in the common room. 2 more minutes until medication round. Emma's blood ran cold. They were planning to drug him. She waited until the men left, then slipped out of the room. The hallway felt endless as she tried to walk normally toward the supply closet. Behind her, she heard the medication cart's wheels squeaking on the linoleum. The supply closet door was locked. For one panicked moment, Emma thought she'd misunderstood until she felt James's key grow warm in her hand. It fit perfectly. Inside, James was already removing the fire escape security bar. He moved with none of his usual slowness, his movements efficient and practiced. They're not just here for me, he said urgently. Victoria's accelerating everything because she found out about the evidence. We have to... The door handle jiggled. A man's voice called out, security check. James pressed a piece of paper into Emma's hand. My handler's safe house. Go there. Now, what about you? A grim smile crossed his face. I didn't survive 30 years by being easy to catch. He reached into a cleaning bucket and pulled out a small black bag. Go. I'll draw them away. But, Emma, his eyes met hers, fierce and determined. Your grandfather saved my life once. Let me return the favor by saving his granddaughter. The door handle turned. Someone was using a key. Fire escape, James commanded. Now, Emma slipped through the window onto the metal landing. Below, she saw 3 more men in maintenance uniforms entering the building's front doors. The supply closet door opened. Emma heard a confused, "What the?" followed by the distinctive sound of a stun gun and a heavy thud. James emerged through the window, moving with the speed and grace of a much younger man. From his bag, he pulled out what looked like small smoke. Grenades, when these go off, use the confusion to get to your car, he instructed. The evidence is what matters now. Keep it safe. What about your family? They're watching the house. Already handled. Michael received an anonymous tip about a last-minute work conference in Seattle. They left an hour ago. He managed a small smile. I've spent 30 years planning for this day. Shouts echoed from inside the building. James pulled a final item from his bag, a small remote detonator. 30 seconds, he said. Head east, away from the main road. Don't stop for anything. He squeezed her shoulder. Thank you, Emma, for helping an old man remember who he really is. Before she could respond, he pressed the detonator. Multiple small explosions rang out from different parts of the building, and smoke began pouring from various windows. Alarms blared and chaos erupted. The last thing Emma saw as she ran for her car was James Chen, not the silent man from room 237, but the detective he'd always been, disappearing into the smoke like a ghost, leading his hunters away from them. Evidence that could finally bring down their empire. As she drove away from Sunset Grove, her volunteer tote bag heavy with 30 years of secrets, Emma realized that the real story was just beginning. And somewhere in the growing darkness, a Grandfather, who had sacrificed everything for his family, was finally fighting back. Emma drove through the darkening streets, taking random turns to shake any potential tail. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel as fire truck sirens wailed in the distance. Heading toward the smoke rising from Sunset Grove, the tote bag sat, heavy on her passenger seat, 30 years of dangerous secrets pressing against her side. The handler's safe house address led her to a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. As she parked, her phone buzzed with a news alert. Fire reported at local retirement home. All residents safely evacuated. At least James's diversion had worked without putting anyone in danger. Room 112 was at the far end of the motel, facing the emergency exit. Emma knocked, according to the pattern James had specified. Too quick, one slow, too quick. The door opened. Immediately, get inside, quick! The man who pulled her in was in his 60s, with sharp eyes and a military bearing. I'm Marcus, James's handler. You brought the box? Emma nodded, clutching her tote bag closer. How did they find him so quickly? The acquisition wasn't supposed to happen for 2 weeks. Someone talked. Marcus was already setting up surveillance. Equipment, multiple screens showing different views of the motel parking lot. We had people inside Phoenix Global, monitoring the acquisition. One of them disappeared last night. They must have broken him. What about James? Is he... He's fine. Just got his signal. Marcus pointed to one of the screens showing a pattern of flashing lights in the distance. He's leading them on a false trail south of the city. Buy us some time to secure the evidence. Emma pulled out the box, watching as Marcus expertly examined the false bottom. Inside lay the USB drive and the sealed envelope she'd found earlier. But there was something else, a small leather notebook, its pages filled with handwritten code. His real case notes, Marcus explained, carefully photographing each page. Everything he gathered over 30 years, banking records, corporate shell companies, political bribes, but most importantly, he held up the USB drive. Proof of Victoria Zhao's original betrayal. The warehouse explosion, Emma said. He recorded her warning to her father. Better, he recorded her planning it. Weeks of surveillance footage, phone taps, everything. Proof that she orchestrated the deaths of 12 police officers to protect herself. Marcus's face hardened. James was supposed to die in that fire too. She just didn't count on how stubborn he could be. A burst of static came from Marcus's radio. James's voice, breathless but clear. Package secure? Affirmative, Marcus responded. Beginning upload now. 3 tails. Losing them in the industrial district. How long? Marcus glanced at the computer where he was copying the USB contents. 20 minutes for full upload to secure servers. You've got 10. They're not all following me. Emma's blood ran cold. They're coming here? Marcus was already moving, grabbing go bags from under the bed. Start photographing the notebook. Every page. High resolution. We need backups before... Headlights swept across the motel window. Marcus killed the lights, peering through a gap. In the curtains. 2 vehicles, professional crew. Time to move. Emma's hands shook as she rapidly photographed the notebook pages, trying to keep the images clear. Outside, car doors opened and closed with quiet precision. Upload at 60%, Marcus muttered, watching the progress bar. Come on, come on. A sound at the back window made them both freeze, then a familiar pattern of taps. Too quick, one slow, too quick. James? Emma whispered. Marcus was already opening the window. James slipped in silently, looking disheveled. But alert. Lost 2 of the tails. 3rd one's good. Former Special Forces. He'll be here in... A soft crunch of gravel outside the door cut him off. Upload at 85%, Marcus reported tensely. James moved to the door, his stance ready. Emma, take the box. There's a drainage tunnel behind the motel. Follow it west until you hit Wilson Street. I'm not leaving you. This isn't about me anymore. James's eyes met hers, fierce and determined. This is about justice for 12 dead officers, about stopping the Phoenix once and for all. The evidence matters more than any of us. The upload hit 90% as footsteps approached their door. Emma shouldered. Her bag heart pounding, James and Marcus flanked the door ready. The next few moments would determine whether 30 years of sacrifice would finally pay off, or if the Phoenix would once again rise from the ashes of their plans. James looked at Emma one last time. "Tell Michael. Tell him I never stopped." Being his father, even when I couldn't be there, the door handle began to turn. The door burst open with enough force to crack the frame. James moved with startling speed, using the door's momentum to knock back the first attacker. Marcus was already moving, his own combat training evident as he engaged the second man. "Upload at 95%. Emma called from the computer, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she tried to speed up the process. The fight was a blur of precise movements and controlled violence. These weren't ordinary thugs. Their movements spoke of military or special, Your Forces training. But James and Marcus were far from helpless. Decades of experience and preparation showed in every calculated move. A third attacker appeared in the doorway, weapon raised. James's voice cut through the chaos. "Emma, now!" She grabbed the box and laptop, still uploading, and dove for the bathroom window as James had instructed earlier. Behind her, she heard the distinctive sound of a stun gun, followed by a heavy thud. The bathroom window was small, but Emma forced herself through, the box clutched tightly to her chest. She landed hard on the gravel outside, the impact driving the air from her lungs. Above her, the sounds of combat continued. "Stop the girl!" a voice commanded. "The evidence is priority." Emma ran, her journalist's bag bouncing against her hip. As she sprinted toward the drainage tunnel James had mentioned, the laptop in her arm showed 98% uploaded. Just a few more seconds to secure the most crucial evidence. Footsteps pounded behind her. She reached the tunnel entrance, dark and uninviting, just as a bullet pinged off the concrete near her head. Without hesitation, she plunged into the darkness. The tunnel was narrow, the floor slick with moisture. Emma pulled out her phone for light, trying to keep her footing while protecting the laptop and box. The upload counter ticked to 99%. A splash behind her. Someone had followed her into the tunnel. Emma forced herself to move faster, remembering James's directions. West. She had to go west. Her phone's flashlight beam caught a junction ahead. East Tunnel was partially collapsed, but the west passage looked clear. As she turned the corner, the laptop chimed softly. Upload complete. Emma allowed herself a moment of fierce triumph. The evidence was secure, transmitted to multiple servers. Even if they caught her now, the truth about Victoria Zhao would still come out. The moment cost her. A hand grabbed her jacket from behind, yanking her backward. Emma let herself fall, using the motion to twist away. The box and laptop went flying, but her attacker's attention followed them, exactly as she'd hoped. While he lunged for the box, Emma scrambled toward a smaller maintenance tunnel she'd spotted. Behind her, she heard the man's triumphant grunt. As he grabbed the evidence, followed immediately by a curse, as he realized the laptop was now blank, Emma squeezed through the maintenance tunnel, barely wide enough for her shoulders. Her pursuer was too broad to follow. His frustrated shout echoed off the concrete walls, followed by the sound of retreating footsteps. He had the box, but she had what mattered most, the uploaded evidence and the photos of James's notebook. Still on her phone, she emerged from the tunnel onto Wilson Street, exactly where James had said she would. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Car waiting, blue sedan, north corner, friend." Emma hesitated only a moment before seeing the car. Through the windshield she recognized the driver, Ted, the maintenance man from Sunset. Grove, the one who'd found the felt lining in James's drawer. He wasn't Phoenix, she realized. He was part of James's backup plan all along. As she ran toward the car, another text came through. "J&M safe. Heading to secondary location. Follow. Protocol 2. Protocol 2, she remembered James's instructions. They would split up, approach the final confrontation from different angles. The Phoenix had the box now, but they didn't understand that it had never been about the physical evidence. Everything they needed was already digital, spreading through. secure networks to carefully chosen recipients. Emma slid into the car, her phone clutched tight. On it were 30 years of secrets, finally ready to see the light of day. But first, they had to survive the night. "Where to?" Ted asked, his hands steady on the wheel. Emma took a deep breath, thinking of James's face when he spoke of his son, of Michael's pain and confusion, of Victoria Zhao's perfectly crafted public image about to shatter. "The newspaper," she said. "It's time to write the story." The city newsroom at midnight was a skeleton crew of tired reporters and fluorescent lights. Emma sat at her professor's borrowed desk, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she pieced together 30 years of secrets. Ted stood guard by the door, his maintenance man demeanor replaced by the alertness of someone with clear security training. "How much time do we have?" Emma asked, not looking up from her screen. "Maybe an hour before they trace the upload location," Ted replied. "Less, if Victoria has as many people in her pocket as we think." Emma nodded, continuing to write. The story was taking shape. The original Golden Phoenix investigation, the warehouse explosion, Victoria's betrayal, and her decades-long transformation of a criminal empire into a corporate dynasty. Each accusation was backed by James's meticulous evidence, now safely uploaded to multiple secure servers. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. "Police headquarters compromised. Victoria's people are moving. Watch for uniforms." As if on cue, they heard sirens in the distance. Ted moved to the window. 3 cars heading this way. "Time to move to backup location." 2 more minutes, Emma insisted, her fingers never stopping. "I just need to—" The newsroom's elevator dinged. Ted's hand moved to his concealed weapon, but it was James who stepped out, looking grimmer than Emma had ever seen him. "Victoria's called an emergency press conference for 6 a.m. She's going to get ahead of the story." "How?" "By announcing her retirement and appointing a successor. Clean break, new leadership, bury the past before we can expose it." He moved to Emma's desk. "The story has to break before she speaks. Has to come from a legitimate source, with enough evidence that it can't be dismissed." Emma gestured to her screen. "Almost ready, but we need a bigger platform than just the city paper. This has to go national, all at once." James nodded. "Marcus is coordinating with contacts at major news outlets. When you're ready, it goes to all of them simultaneously." The sirens were getting closer. Ted's phone buzzed with an alert. "Police scanner shows they're setting up roadblocks. Boxing us in." Emma's fingers moved faster, racing against time and approaching sirens. James watched the words appear on her screen, his expression softening as she described his sacrifice, his years of silent vigilance, his protection of a family that thought he'd abandoned them. 3 minutes to roadblocks being in place, Ted warned. Emma was in full journalist mode now, every detail sharp and clear. "The evidence is embedded in the story. Even if they stop us, as long as it sends—" The lights went out. In the sudden darkness, they heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. The elevators would be disabled too. Ted moved to secure the door while James pulled Emma away from the computer. "Battery. Back up," she said urgently. "The computer will stay on for 15 minutes. If I can just—" "Emma." James's voice was firm. "The story isn't finished yet." She looked at him, understanding dawning. The ending was still being written, here in the darkness, as Victoria's forces closed in. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine how this decades-long saga concluded. Through the windows, they could see police lights painting the street in red and blue. But these weren't regular officers. Their movements were too precise, too coordinated. Victoria's people, wearing police uniforms to maintain her carefully crafted illusion of legitimacy. In the darkness of the newsroom, James Chen stood straight and tall, no longer pretending to be a frail old man. His eyes held the same fierce determination Emma had first noticed during those evening news broadcasts at Sunset Grove. "Send what you have," he said, "then get ready to move. It's time to finish this story the way it should have ended 30 years ago." Emma turned back to the computer, its screen glowing in the darkness like a beacon. The truth was ready to emerge. All she had to do was hit send before Victoria's forces reached them. Below, car doors slammed. Boots thundered on stairs. The clock was striking midnight, marking the moment when 30 years of secrets would finally see the light of day, if they could survive the next few minutes. The stairwell door burst open just as Emma's finger hit the send button. Her story, along with all of James's evidence, shot out to news outlets across the country. Ted immediately overturned a desk, creating cover as the first fake officers stormed in. "Clear the room!" a commanding voice shouted. "This is a police operation!" "No," came a smooth, feminine voice. "This is a family matter." Victoria Zhao stepped into the newsroom, elegant even at midnight in a perfectly tailored suit. She looked more like a CEO arriving for a board meeting than someone orchestrating an armed assault. "Detective Chen," she said, looking at James. "You're looking well for a dead man." James stepped out from behind the desk, positioning himself between Victoria and Emma. "You shouldn't have gone after my family, Victoria." "Family?" She laughed softly. "You gave up your family. Just like you gave up your career, your identity, everything. To what end? To protect evidence that no one will believe." Emma's phone buzzed. The story was live. Major news networks were already picking it up. Victoria's phone chimed at the same time. Her expression hardened as she read the screen. "Do you really think this changes anything? I have judges, politicians, police chiefs in my pocket. By morning, this will be dismissed as a conspiracy theory." "Check your secure accounts," James said quietly. "Marcus has been busy while we kept you distracted." Victoria's fingers flew over her phone. Her composed mask cracked slightly. In the 30 years since she'd betrayed the police investigation, she'd built her power on digital foundations. Encrypted accounts, hidden transactions, computerized records. And now, thanks to Marcus's cyber team, those foundations were being exposed. "This is impossible," she whispered. "The files were encrypted. I learned about computers in witness protection," James said. "Spent 30 years keeping up with technology while you thought I was falling behind. Every time you evolved your empire, I evolved my investigation." Footsteps. On the stairs again. But these were different. Through the windows, they could see real police cars arriving, lights flashing. Victoria's fake officers looked to her uncertainly. "It's over," James said. "The evidence is out. Your accounts are exposed. In about 30 seconds, real federal agents will walk through that door with very real warrants." Victoria's composure shattered. She pulled a gun from her jacket. Not the standard issue her fake officers carried, but a small, elegant weapon that matched her refined appearance. "You think I survived this long by giving up?" The gun pointed steadily at James's chest. "One last loose end to tie up. Poetic, really. You'll die as Detective Chen after all." "No!" The shout came from the doorway. Michael Zhang stood there, still in his Seattle business clothes, staring at the scene in shock. "Michael," James's voice cracked, "you're supposed to be safe." "I saw the story breaking online," Michael said. "Recognized your old case photos when I realized my father was Detective James Chen." His eyes were full of understanding and pride. "I had to come." Victoria's gun wavered between James and Michael. How touching. A family reunion. "Drop your weapon." New voices, real authorities flooding into the newsroom with guns drawn. FBI agents, tactical teams, all responding to the evidence Emma's story had revealed. Victoria's fake officers were already surrendering, but she remained steady, her gun still trained on James. "You cost me everything once before, Detective. I won't let you—" The gun fired. Several things happened at once. Ted tackled Emma to the ground, James lunged for Michael, and Victoria's perfect suit blossomed red from the shoulder shot fired by an FBI sniper. As federal agents swarmed the room, Michael reached his father. They stared at each other for a long moment before Michael pulled James into a fierce hug. I understand now, Michael whispered, why you left, what you were protecting us from. All this time, James held his son tightly, 30 years of silence. Finally broken. I never stopped being your father, not for a single day. Emma watched as Victoria was led away in handcuffs, her empire crumbling in real time as news alerts kept buzzing on phones around the room. 30 years of secrets were exploding into the light, and a father's sacrifice was finally being vindicated. The sun was rising over the city, marking the end of the longest night and the beginning of something new. In the growing light, Chen stood with his son, no longer a silent man in room 237, but a father, a detective and a hero who had never stopped fighting for justice, even in the quietest ways. 2 days later, James sat in his son's living room, surrounded by the family he'd been forced to watch from a distance for so long. Lily was curled up next to him on the couch, refusing to leave his side since he'd arrived. Susan brought coffee and kept squeezing his shoulder as she passed, as if reassuring herself he was really there. The morning news played quietly on the television, not because James needed to monitor it anymore, but out of habit. Every channel was still covering the Phoenix Global scandal. Victoria Zhao's arrest had triggered a cascade of revelations, exposing corrupt officials and hidden criminal enterprises across the country. So all those times you were watching the news at Sunset Grove. Michael sat across from his father, still processing everything, keeping track of their movements, James confirmed. The evening news was my window into their world. Every business deal, every political appointment, every seemingly random accident, it all told a story. And the silence? Susan asked gently. Was that part of your cover? James looked down at Lily, who was playing with his fingers, the same fingers that had tapped out countless coded messages. Silence was safer. Anything I said could have put you all at risk, but watching you from a distance, his voice roughened. That was the hardest part. I saw you, you know, Michael said quietly. At Lily's soccer game last month, I thought I was imagining things, seeing a figure at the edge of the park that looked like you. James nodded. I couldn't stay away completely. Even though I knew it was dangerous, I had to see. He trailed off, emotion making it hard to continue. Grandpa, Lily looked up at him. Mom says you're a hero, that you fought bad guys. The real heroes were the officers who died in that warehouse, James said softly. I just tried to finish what they started, to make sure their sacrifice meant something. Emma, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, saw the moment Michael truly understood the weight his father had carried all these years. The pain of abandoning his family had been worse than any danger he'd faced. I found this in the box of your things from Sunset Grove, Michael said, pulling out the old Christmas photo, the last picture taken before James had gone into hiding. You knew even then, didn't you, that you'd have to leave? Got the warning. 2 days before Christmas, James admitted, but I couldn't bear to ruin the holiday. Wanted one last perfect day with my family. Susan wiped tears from her eyes. All those times we were angry, thinking you'd just given up. Your anger kept you safe, James said. If you'd known the truth, if you'd acted differently, they might have noticed. Your pain protected you, even though it broke my heart to cause it. Lily suddenly jumped up. Wait here. She ran upstairs, returning moments later with a stack of handmade cards. I made these for you, one for every week you were gone. Mom said we couldn't send them to Sunset Grove, but I kept making them anyway. James's hands trembled as he looked. Through the cards, each one filled with a child's love and hope. I made things for you, too, he said softly. Every day in that room I wrote letters I couldn't send, drew pictures I couldn't give you. We have time now, Michael said firmly. Time to share everything we missed. No more silence, no more secrets. James pulled his granddaughter close, reached for his son's hand. The morning sun streamed through the windows, warming the room where a family was knitting itself back together, healing wounds that had been necessary but could finally be addressed. Tapju. Television continued to report on Victoria's downfall, but James wasn't watching anymore. His vigilance was no longer needed. Instead, he listened to Lily's chatter about school, to Susan's plans for dinner, to Michael's quiet questions about the past. The silence that had protected them was over. Now it was time for words, for stories, for all the love that had never stopped growing, even in the quietest times. 6 months later, Sunset Grove Senior Living had a new name and new management, but many of its residents chose to stay, including some who had never suspected the drama unfolding in their midst. The common room still showed the evening news, though now without its most attentive viewer. James had moved in with Michael's family, converting the guest room into his own space. The walls, once bare like his room at Sunset Grove, now displayed family photos spanning decades, including the Christmas picture that had marked his last day before hiding. Beside it hung newspaper clippings about the Phoenix Global case and a framed letter of commendation from the FBI for his 30 years of undercover work. Emma's exposé had won several journalism awards, but more importantly to her, it had led to reforms in corporate oversight and law enforcement. She visited the Chenjiang household regularly, often finding James in the backyard, teaching Lily the Morse code he had used for so many years. Dit-a-dit, Lily would tap out carefully on the patio table, while James smiled and corrected her. Rhythm. The retired officers who had survived the original warehouse incident came to visit, bringing with them stories and memories of the young detective James Chen had been. They understood now why their colleague had disappeared and the silence he had maintained to protect them all. Mrs. Peterson from Sunset Grove sent regular cards, always signing them with, "I knew there was more to your story." The Collins sisters insisted on having James as a guest speaker at their mystery book club, though he politely declined to discuss certain operational details. Ted had returned to his maintenance work, though now he did it for a private security firm. He still dropped by occasionally to check on James, their shared secret having forged a lasting friendship. Marcus retired properly this time, occasionally joining James for quiet fishing trips where they could reflect on their long years of hidden collaboration. The handler and his charge had become something more like brothers, bound by decades of trust and shared purpose, but the most profound changes were the small ones. James attended every one of Lily's soccer games, sitting proudly in the front row, instead of watching from a distance. He helped Michael with home improvement projects on weekends, making up for lost time with quiet conversations over paint cans and power tools. Susan regularly found him in the kitchen early in the morning, preparing breakfast for everyone. No more institutional meals on a rigid schedule. The nightmares still came sometimes. Memories of the warehouse, of Victoria's betrayal, of the years of enforced separation from his family. But now, instead of facing them alone in a silent room, he had his family's support and understanding. One evening, as James sat helping Lily with her homework, Michael watched them from the doorway. The sight of his father's patience, his gentle guidance, his evident joy in these simple moments, it was everything they had missed during those 3 months of believing he had abandoned them. But it was also everything they had gained back, made more precious by the understanding of what it had cost him to keep them safe. The evening news still played in the background, but James no longer watched it with the same intensity. His battles were over. His silence had been broken, and in its place he had found something better, the simple, profound peace of being a father, a grandfather, and a hero who could finally rest, surrounded by the love he had sacrificed everything to protect. 1 year to the day after the night at the newsroom, the Chenjiang family gathered for a special celebration. The backyard was decorated with lights, and familiar faces from the past year filled the space with warmth and laughter. Mrs. Peterson and the Collins sisters had come from Sunset Grove, now swapping stories with the retired officers who'd known James in his detective days. Ted and Marcus stood by the grill, arguing good-naturedly about proper burger flipping technique. Emma, fresh from accepting a National Journalism Award for her investigation, sat with Lily, both of them tapping out secret messages on the patio table. James stood at the center of it all, no longer the silent man from room 237, but a father, grandfather, and hero whose story had changed lives. The evening news played quietly from an outdoor television, more out of tradition now than necessity. The headline spoke of Phoenix Global's assets being redistributed to victims' families, of Victoria Zhao's conviction, of systemic reforms in corporate oversight. Michael raised his glass, calling for attention. "A year ago," he began, "I thought I'd lost my father to silence and resignation. Instead, I discovered that silence itself can be an act of love, that sacrifice sometimes looks like surrender, and that true courage often goes unnoticed. To my father, who never stopped protecting us even when we didn't know we needed protection." James embraced his son, words unnecessary between them now. Lily ran up to join the hug, followed by Susan. The family that had been fractured by necessary secrets was whole again, stronger for having survived the breaking. As twilight settled over the gathering, James watched his granddaughter teaching Emma's young journalism students the Morse code that had once been his only voice. He saw the next generation learning that truth could survive silence, that love could endure separation, that heroes didn't always announce themselves with words. The story of the silent grandfather and his 30-year vigil had become more than just a headline. It had become a lesson about justice, patience, and the quiet courage of those who protect others without recognition. In the end, James Chen had proved that some silences speak louder than words, and some love runs deeper than daily presence. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, James sat surrounded by his extended family, blood relatives and found family alike. The evening news ended, and no one moved to turn up the volume or check the headlines. The silence that fell was different now, not a shield or a burden, but simply peace, filled with the gentle sounds of family, friendship, and a love that had survived 30 years of quiet sacrifice to bloom again in the light.